Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladin Yuracek.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today, we have a special treat, something we've never done before. We kind of have a round table going on today. So it's with former guest Doug Clinton of Loup Ventures, the VC fund that has recently invested in Paradromics, the massively parallel brain implant, and Manfred Franke, one of the favorite guests of the podcast, who's been on twice, who previously working at Oculeave, now has founded Neuronoff, and he's always very, very good at explaining things. And a good friend of all of ours is Avery Bedows, who is a blogger at the Substrate, and he's also working now at Loup Ventures, and he's kind of the one moderating everything. So we go over some questions with some of the ethics and some of the future themes that are going to be happening, that are going to be going on in the field of neuromodulation, a field that all of us really, really like. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this. We were 4 people on the call, so there were a bit of technical issues. Hopefully we'll have resolved that. But yeah, hope everything goes well, and we'll talk more on the other side.
The topic of this episode of the Loup Ventures Neurotechnology podcast is what, how, when, and why should neurotechnology be discussed in the public? Now, normally we have our partner Doug Clinton hosting the podcast and we invite one guest. But for this topic in particular, though, there are many viewpoints that are important to consider. So what we've done is we actually have not one, but 3 guests on for this episode. We have Ladin Yuracek of the Neural Implant podcast. We have Dr. Manfred Franke of Neuronoff. And we have Doug Clinton from Loup Ventures. To kick it off, I'd like everyone to just give a quick little introduction about who they are and what the experience they have is that they think will contribute to a unique perspective on public discussion of neurotechnology. Ladin, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Excellent. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm the host of the Neural Implant Podcast, and I've recently started working at University of Florida in the Kevin Otto Lab, the neuroprosthetics lab. And so I've really gotten to know a lot of people in the neural implant space, and it must be something like 50 guests now, and I've attended a few conferences now and really gotten to know, a good portion, a good ratio of the field. So I don't know. I think it's really important to kind of gauge and get like an average of what everybody's thinking and which direction the field is progressing. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for the introduction, Ladin. Manfred?
Thank you, Avery, for having me on here with you, Ladin and Doug. As mentioned earlier, Ladin and I have had conversations about a year or so back where we talked more about the technological issues in neural engineering. And it's certainly important to now add that aspect of points like the when and why is neurotechnology being discussed in public. Maybe a quick background for me is that I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Neuronoff Incorporated, which is a startup here located in Valencia, California, and we're working on neuromodulation solutions for peripheral neuropathic pain. I have a background in neural engineering from Case Western Reserve University and an electrical engineering master's from Dresden and Freiburg in Germany. From a practical point of view, I got some experience, obviously, both at Case as well as the practical immersion that we had in college, but especially putting things to work at Boston Scientific, where I worked on nerve block technology to prevent unwanted muscle activity when nerves like the vagus nerve was being stimulated, as well as later on during my work at Oculeave, which was a startup in the San Francisco Bay Area that worked on neurostimulation solutions for dry eye disease with the goal to increase tear production and provide a full and healthy tear. So basically helping the body to work on healing itself with its own tears instead of just using artificial tears. There I ran preclinical for a while and made sure that the clinical studies that we then designed and executed were done well. And I helped with translating some of the preclinical work later on in clinical trials that helped, obviously, on the marketing side. So you could basically say that in this round of us here having a virtual coffee on University Avenue in Palo Alto is that I'm trying to provide both the technology and the R&D point of view.
Thank you, Manfred. And last but not least, we have Doug Clinton from Loup Ventures. Doug?
Yep, Avery, thanks for hosting. It's fun to be on the other side of the conversation as a guest, and thanks, Loudon and Manfred, for joining. For those not familiar, Loup Ventures is a frontier tech-focused venture fund, and one of the frontiers that we've been exploring is neurotechnology fairly broadly, both for consumer and clinical applications. And I think what hopefully Avery and I can add to the conversation as we lead the practice at Loup Ventures is some of the deep thinking that we've done together and with the community about sort of the opportunities in the space, and also some of the ethical questions and debate around how to properly bring some of these products to market.
Thank you, Doug. So what we have here is we have a person who spent a lot of time on the media side of neurotechnology. We have a scientist / entrepreneur / engineer, and we have a couple of investors. So these are three really unique views that I think they're going to work well together in tackling this topic of public discussion of neurotechnology. Now, before we dive into the really juicy part of the conversation, I think that it's going to be really helpful to our listeners to establish some background information to really dig into the topic. And it's also worth noting here that this actually exemplifies a broader issue that we'll probably touch on later, which is how to handle the different levels of scientific knowledge within the public forum. Now, I listened previously to Manfred's podcast with Loudoun, where Manfred gives this hour-and-a-half-long incredible overview into neurotechnology. Manfred, do you think you can condense that down into a 3 to 5 minute blurb about what is neurotechnology, why is it important, why are all four of us excited about it, and realistically, why is our listener tuning into this podcast?
All right, that's a vast topic. So let me start with what the nervous system is and what it means for us. Think about the nerves in your body as a highway system designed to exchange information in the same way that the bloodstream exchanges both nutrients and information via hormones. This means that interfacing with nerves may allow us to have a treatment effect anywhere in the body, similar to how you would take a pill that reaches a specific destination via the bloodstream. The big difference, though, is that the pills are less discriminate than neurostimulation can be, and that pills are rarely capable of truly repairing something that has been fully damaged. To give you an example, a pill is rarely able to help a person see again after that person has gone blind. But there are companies out there, for example, one in France, one in Germany, one not far away from here in Southern California and LA, that electrically stimulate the retina, that's the sensitive part of your eye, or stimulate electrically the visual cortex of your brain. If you're an individual who has gone blind, in order to provide you the impression of light and thereby have the ability to navigate in darkness again and have an impression of where there's a door, where there's a window, where there might be a chair in front of you. Furthermore, second example, there are cochlear implants out there that are devices that help people regain the ability to hear after they have lost hearing due to an illness or an accident. And last but not least, maybe just another general example that many people know of, there are stimulators for either the spinal cord, for example, for the treatment of pain, or for the brain, for individuals who are either suffering from conditions like spinal cord injury or stroke or Parkinson's disease, to regain more controlled movements of their body again. Now, all of that is possible because neuromodulation is akin to playing virtual reality with the person's nervous system. What do I mean by that? With that, I mean that if you have an organ, such as an organ in your belly, or a muscle that is supposed to contract, or the brain or spinal cord, they are innervated, as we just discussed, and they do not know if a signal arriving on a nerve to them, if that signal is actually coming from somewhere within the body, or if it is originating from electric stimulation that has been provided to that nerve that is reaching that organ. That can be elicited electrically, can be elicited by ultrasound, mechanical stimulation, laser stimulation. There's a couple of ways that we can initiate what is called an action potential. And if you provide this action potential on a nerve, you basically transmit an information to the innervated organ. Now, that means that we can both treat conditions on the one hand, treat symptoms on the other hand, or, which might actually make it very interesting to all of us here, provide the impression of augmented reality to the body by interfacing with nerves, which is, I think, how the four of us get together here today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that overview. So, as you can tell, there's lots of interesting stuff to dig into in the neurotechnology world. Obviously, we can't touch on all of that right here, but hopefully that will provide a good starting point to dive into the first thing I want to discuss. And that is, I just want to go around to the three of you and ask if there are any specific instances you can recall where you've seen neuroscience and or neurotechnology in the news. Do you have any takeaways?
I guess I'll start with that, and I think I'm going to take everybody's answer and just say that, we've had some recent billionaires that are like, I'm going to invest in this space, and the most notable of which, of course, is Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, and he started Neuralink basically to broadband interfaces with the brain, and basically his goal is to Twitter at 1,000 characters per second. That's of course a joke, but another one is Brian Johnson of Kernel, and both of them put like hundreds of millions of dollars of their own money into this, and they really see a big future with it. And generally, I've seen a lot of TV shows, I've seen a lot of science shows that have talked about some of the technologies that I've covered, and honestly, with some of the people, some of the leaders in the field that I've talked with, and they just say it's the coolest thing ever. And I have to agree. It's a great TV special.
The first thing that comes to mind for me, Avery, is the Wait But Why article that Tim Urban did a little while back describing Neuralink.
It's a fantastic article.
It is worth reading, yeah, for anybody who hasn't read it yet. It's almost a book. I don't even know if calling it an article is doing it justice.
I think I checked. It's 33,000 words. Don't hold me to that. It's somewhere in that ballpark.
Close to a book, yeah. And I think, he describes the technology in great detail. I think he does a very good job of explaining both technically how it works, but also sort of some of the applications that we might expect to use it for in the future. And I think anytime a media person, even someone that's as sophisticated as Tim Urban, is explaining a complicated technology, a frontier technology to the masses, there's always a risk for the broader public to feel a sense of worry. I think in some ways, all technology that is something new by definition can be scary because change is inherently scary for people. And so I think that, number one, that's an awesome article that everyone should read. Number two, I think the reaction, whether it's to that article or other things that sort of describe some of these potential futures that we can create, I think the initial reaction for some people, not all, is that it does feel a little scary for them because it's so different and so profound.
Yeah, Doug, I agree. The question of neuromodulation, especially as an implant technology, is described into great detail at Wait But Why, is something that is scary if you look at it from the perspective of, hey, what is going to happen to me, and do I really want this? And if it's implanted, is there a way to remove it? There's a lot of ethical questions involved that one should never underestimate the width and breadth and depth. But at the same time, what comes to mind for me when we're talking about recent publications is actually that the NIH is starting to invest a lot of money into neuromodulation technology in the same way as GlaxoSmithKline started doing that in 2012, so about 5-6 years ago, with them deciding to go into an area that is supposed to pick up where drugs leave off. In that sense that when a patient normally starts with a treatment, medical devices or medicine in general, the treatment starts with drugs and the benefits outweigh the side effects. But usually as the body adapts, you have to increase the drug dose. And then at some point, the side effects outweigh the benefits. And that's the point when you have to look
into alternative treatments because people might get addicted to the drug and likewise. And that's where neuromodulation technology, by providing a totally different pathway, but the same effect, treatment effect, as drugs might be, provides an alternative avenue, so to say, that both drug companies and the NIH have realized they need to put some money into in order for it to be developed for the greater good. So I see a lot of publications recently again, both from the NIH as well as recently from DARPA, to develop neuromodulation applications, be it invasive, so implantable, or topical applications thereof. And I think that's a very good development because it just offers patients alternatives to drugs that might be not providing the benefit with the level of positive effects instead of side effects for them.
Thank you, Manfred. I'd like to also throw my own 2 cents in here. What comes to mind for me are the public news media articles that describe the results of neuroimaging studies. This isn't a verbatim title of an article or a report, but I'm sure something out there is similar where researchers find love to exist in X region of the brain. And it's a sexy title. It's intriguing because here's this human thing, love, that is it's so substantial in our subjective experience. And this media, it reports that it can be reduced into this very concrete understanding of a module of the brain that's responsible for it. And the truth of the matter is it's way more complicated than that. The neuroimaging methods are extremely complicated and nuanced, and you have to be very careful about how you interpret them. The idea of a single module in the brain representing a specific function is highly contested and not the prevailing theory at this point. So that is what comes to mind immediately for me is reductive reporting of neuroimaging. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. But I also want to comment that both Manfred and Doug mentioned this notion of the fear around neurotechnology and the weight of ethical implications. And there seems to be something underlying this. And it seems to be that, at least to me, it feels like there's something fundamentally different about neurotechnology from other technologies. And Doug and I debate this all the time. But this fundamental difference would then, in theory, necessitate particular care in the public discussion. So I want to open this question up to you guys. Is there something different about neurotechnology from, for example, consumer software technology or consumer hardware technology like phones? And if so, how does that influence how we should be discussing it? How does this relate to stem cell research or genetic engineering or artificial intelligence, which also bear heavy ethical connotations?
I'd love to start. And maybe my comments maybe even serve to stir the pot a little bit. As Avery mentioned, we debate this often. And for me, like I've always had this sort of first principle that maybe even taking a step back to give a quote as to why I have this first principle. There's a legendary quote from John Templeton, who is one of the best public stock market investors in history. And he said that the biggest fallacy, the most dangerous thing anyone can ever say as it comes to investing is this time is different, because you fool yourself into believing that history hasn't taught us anything. And where I kind of come from on this question is not necessarily that there aren't important ethical implications for neurotechnology, but that really everything, any product that we use as consumers, any medicine we use to get healthy has its own set of ethical questions. Anything we do really has sort of some of these ethical questions. And, Avery mentioned AI. There's certainly questions there about the safety around that. There's genetic engineering, and there's so many other different technological verticals that could have profound impact on the human experience. It's hard for me to say that, okay, neurotechnology, there's something about this one vertical. This time is different. And, I feel like there's a fundamental danger there to think that any one of these things is so different from the other or anything we've dealt with in the past. To say that, somehow we need to treat it differently and ignore all of the past constructs that we've created around ethics. And maybe the real answer is some of those past constructs are valuable for the current discussion and maybe could even help solve some of the questions we have today about neuroethics and, AI, genetic engineering, et cetera.
Ladin.
Yeah, so I've talked about what I do and this project and everything to, hundreds of people. And I really haven't heard anybody say like, oh, that's not good or that's unethical or something like this, questioning the ethics. I guess the first thing that comes to mind for me would be kind of a lack of control, because you would have somebody else or something else controlling you. They could theoretically like have you karate chop somebody and you didn't even want to do that. And then they're like, whoa, why did you karate chop me? And I was like, sorry, it wasn't me. But they might not believe you. Anyways, I personally think that things like, nuclear fission and radiation, this is way, way more dangerous and way harder to control. But I don't think it's too bad. And again, kind of what Doug was talking about, the ethical implications. I mean, in my mind, pharma is much worse, so especially things like, global drugs that you take, and God knows what the side effects are, and God knows how long it's going to, it affects so many other organs instead of the targeted organ. And don't even get me started about hormones and how bad that is. And like that literally changes who you are as a person. You're taking estrogen or testosterone or any other hormone. It's huge. It's huge. It changes how aggressive you are. It changes everything about you. So I think that to me is a much bigger issue. And I mean, I may be in the minority saying like, hey, drugs or pharmaceuticals are much worse than anything that you could do with neurostimulation. But I think I'm in a minority. I haven't really debated that with anybody. So I would love to do that one day.
If I may interject here. So I have been reading a book called Scientific and Philosophical Perspectives in Neuroethics. It's edited by Jim Giordano and Bert Gorgon. I apologize, Bert, if I mispronounced your last name. There is a particular quote in here which summarizes how I feel about this that I'd like to share. It's on page 328 for anyone who's interested. And it reads, "Neuroscience policy, like genetic policy, has distinctive importance in contemporary politics because it challenges intensely held societal values relating to the self, privacy, discovery, justice, health, and rights." What I get out of this is that there's something about the brain that, at least under the modern scientific view, pertains to what I would call the essence of personhood. And that is why I personally feel that there's something distinct about neurotechnology in contrast with other technology, because these technologies interact with an ostensible substrate or partial substrate of that essence. I just wanted to throw that out there, to use Doug's phrase, stir the pot.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, like, this time is different. Like what Doug was saying, it's really not different. So, I mean, if you inject like god awful amounts of steroids, testosterone, you're going to be a different person. There's no doubt about it. Like anybody who's ever met you before is going to be like, whoa, this person's not the same person as they used to be. So I'm also maybe stirring the pot more. I don't know how we're using this expression, but I would say it's not any different than before. It may be on a faster time scale, but instantaneous theoretically, but it's not going to be that different than before.
Manfred, do you have any thoughts on this you'd like to add?
Yes, especially with two of you stirring the pot, I'm going to try to calm things down.
Well, thank you. We needed that.
And that is, let me add two thoughts fundamentally. Number one, as we're talking about access to a person's thoughts, a person's fears, a person's wishes, basically access to a person's brain, we have to understand that it is incredibly hard to get a reproducible effect in a lot of people with neuromodulation when you go into stimulating their brain or trying to read data from their brain with something as simple and straightforward as EEG. That's an electroencephalogram, when you have electrodes on the outside of the skull and you read electrical signals that give you an idea of brain activity. With these methods, for example, you cannot read out a person's thoughts. You can merely distinguish with a lot of processing, and usually in combination with a person sitting in MRI, inside an MRI, and measuring where blood flow is going in their brain, that you can merely say, this person is thinking yes or no. So fundamentally, with these kind of technologies, there is already the ability, yes, you can distinguish if somebody says yes or thinks yes or no. But it is, with our current technology, especially as we're talking implanted technology, very, very hard to get specific information out of the brain that are more than just a yes-no answer, number one. And number two, if you think of the newest developments done to help people who have had an accident or an illness that make them a quadriplegic, for example, and meaning they cannot move their hands or legs, and they are implanted with a chip that has about 100 electrodes on it, you are able to get some very good reading how they want to move their arm or their leg. And so if they want to go more left or more right. But it takes about a month or two of very intensive training of basically a wall of computers inside a room that's in the same room as the person that is connected to that wall of computers. People point to that and say this looks like the Matrix, basically, that you're directly connected into the brain of a person. And while this is fundamentally true, you're reading electrical signals from the brain, from the premotor cortex or from the motor cortex. So it is either the motion planning or the actual brain activity leading to the motion that would lead to the motion of an arm that you can read out. It takes a month to train the algorithms of those computers. We are nowhere close to simplify that in a little package that you can take with you. We are nowhere close to get these signals to be long-term stable, because that's one thing that, I want to point out as well. There's a difference between putting something into the body and getting clean signals from the first hour to about the first day to the kind of signals that you get after about a month, because your body reacts to something that you place into your body with a scabbing. So the technical term is encapsulation. Your body forms a shield around it. If it can't get rid of it, it tries to wall it off. And that means that you lose signal. So you basically lose the ability to record in a high enough quality that you would be able to distinguish between a finer signal than just a general yes or no. And this is just to give you a couple of little things that the last 10 years has been discovered numerous times as a fundamental outcome by many labs in the US, by DARPA, and by many other companies, other locations outside the US, that were trying to either record with a high number of electrodes or were trying to stimulate a lot of little points. Now, with that in mind, the FDA is giving out a guidance, Food and Drug Administration is giving out guidances fundamentally that help with the development and clearance of medical products. And the general approach that the FDA takes is a product is only going to be possible to be approved for people if the benefits outweigh the risks. So if you talk about something that's implanted that, for example, helps with Parkinson's disease, then it must be relatively low risk to conduct that implantation. It must be relatively low risk to have the device with you as you walk around in your everyday life.
Manfred,
yeah.
I'd like to take this opportunity to actually launch into a quick tangent, because you brought up the FDA. That's a perfect transition into where I wanted to go next with this. So if you'll forgive me, I like to hijack this thread because I think it's such a good transition point.
Sure thing.
So the FDA gets involved when a neurotechnology is intended for medical purpose. Manfred has spent a lot of time working both with actually non-invasive medical technologies and invasive medical technologies. When he talked about the case of a quadriplegic patient who has a neural implant that's obviously invasive, you have to open up the skull. And so one big bucket of neurotechnology is medical, but there's also the side of consumer neurotechnologies, as we discussed way back at the beginning. One example that comes to mind, which I think is particularly interesting, is actually no longer on the market. There's a company called Think, which I think in 2015 released an externally worn neurostimulation device. It would stimulate the trigeminal and facial nerves, as well as, I think, C2 and C3 cranial spinal nerves. And in doing so, could either create a sensation of relaxation or of energy. They released a second product. They have since pivoted. But this idea of consumer product that can modulate affect or modulate emotion, I think, is a really interesting example of consumer neurotechnology. And so going back to the topic of our discussion here, which is the discussion of neurotechnology to the public, and I really want to hone in on that and focus on this idea of how and when and why neurotechnology should be discussed to the public. What are the differences between that for consumer and medical neurotechnologies? How is the public going to respond differently, do you think, to consumer versus medical technology? In terms of the media reporting on these technologies, to what extent is the accuracy, or I should say scientific accuracy, important for a consumer versus a medical neurotechnology? And finally, what is the downstream impact on public perception, or rather of public perception on these technologies? So for example, if medical neurotechnology is reported as achieving something versus a consumer neurotechnology is reported as achieving something, and the public eats it up, starts getting discussed, what impacts will those filter back to have on research and on commercial applications?
I'd be happy to start. I think maybe the first way to think about it is sort of from a risk standpoint as the end consumer. And the way that I think about it a little bit is when you are dealing with a medical neurotechnology device or application, you are sort of by definition relying on your doctor to have a very deep understanding of whatever that product is that he or she is prescribing you to use. And so in that sense, you're sort of transferring the risk of understanding off to a medical professional that you in some way trust. From a consumer standpoint, you're by definition taking on that risk on your own, right? And that's true of any consumer technology product that someone might use, or any product really. I mean, you could even argue for, something like smoking or drinking alcohol. There are definite risks to using those products as a consumer, and there's some ostensible or at least tacit understanding that that those products are not necessarily good for you, but you accept the risks and you do them anyway. And so that's kind of how I think about it from a high level is, you're sort of transferring risk when you're using a medical device because there's a professional involved. When you're a consumer, there's at least philosophically a need for a better understanding of what the product does in practice, as we've seen kind of using that maybe alcohol or other substance example. People may not always be as knowledgeable as they should be about any product that they use, neurotech included. But I think there's at least an assumption that they should be more knowledgeable. And I think as a consumer neurotech company, it may even be an advantage for companies that do a very good job of describing explicitly how their product works, what the risks are, making it understandable for the average consumer. And to the extent that consumers get more comfortable with that understanding, they're probably more likely to buy. So I think there is kind of like a capitalistic endpoint for that in that sense.
Doug, I want to push on this a little bit more. I know that you recently purchased and have been trying the Halo Sport headband from Halo Neuroscience. For those of you who don't know, the Halo headband is a set of headphones that uses transcranial direct current stimulation to, as they call it, prime the motor cortex so that it can learn more easily. And the idea is for an athlete to wear it and improve more quickly. Doug is an amateur athlete, and so that's why he's been using it. And I know, Doug, you and I were talking a little bit about the terms of service, or terms and conditions, I believe, for the Halo. And you had some thoughts on that. You want to share them?
Yeah, I actually think they did an interesting thing that I think was a positive experience for me as a user, which is anytime any of us use a consumer electronic, we all sign these terms of service. It's on your iPhone when you set up your iPhone for the first time, or your Mac for the first time. I doubt anybody has ever read the full document, so we have no idea what we're signing ourselves away to. There's even a funny South Park episode about that, about how none of us read kind of what we're signing up for. But what's interesting for Halo is what they did is they have that kind of standard long form legal document about what you are agreeing to as a user. And then they have a second page as you're signing up on the application to start using the device that specifically calls out a few things that if you are, for example, pregnant, if you have had seizures in the past, you should not use this device. So they call it out very explicitly to try to protect people. And I think just as best practice, that felt really powerful to me because it wasn't this, unending page of text that I knew I wasn't going to read. It was 4 or 5 lines that was very highlighted, and I knew that they wanted me to pay attention for that 1 second to read it and understand it, and I did.
Doug, may I ask you a question in that regard, actually?
Sure.
That device, the Halo, is a consumer device. It's not a medical device, correct?
Correct.
So that means that the Halo never had to go through clinical trials.
That's correct. Yep, to my knowledge, yeah.
The reason why I'm pointing that out is because these would be the typical things that you would, when you conduct a clinical trial, would be the first questions a doctor would actually ask a patient. So what I see here is a parallel mechanism that Halo, the team of Halo, has taken, that they basically ask the patient, or the user in that case, really early on, are you pregnant? did you have any seizures, thinking of the primary risk factors that may be affected if a person were to use this device. Those are the kinds of things that are also in a label as a contraindication. A label is something that a medical device receives after it has been cleared by the FDA for a specific indication. And I think this is where the major differentiator actually is, that it kind of chimes in with what Doug said earlier, that you give away some of the risk to the doctor who is making the call on what device or drug you should use for the treatment of a specific condition, which is not done when you purchase something as a consumer electronic. And that's why I think it's intelligent, definitely, what the Taylor's team has done to ask these kinds of questions, similar to the way how a clinician would do, simply because they understand that the use of this consumer electronic device can have that side effect, similar to stethoscope light, that you would not ask a person to use that has had seizures before, for example, or certain electronics that you're not supposed to use when you have a cardiac pacemaker, because it might actually mess up the signal of the pacemaker. That makes sense.
So let me take this in a slightly meta direction. So Doug and Manfred have sort of conjointly commented on, at least at first glance, seems like a best practice for consumer neurotechnology, namely to take something that would have been done in a clinical trial and put a nice UI around it, give it to users rather than patients. And given the sort of the original question here is differences between consumer medical neurotechnology in their discussion to the public, we've hopefully identified a best practice that can make consumer neurotechnology even safer than a baseline. And given that we, or at least I think there will be, and there is and will continue to be, general fear around the use of consumer neurotechnologies, how do we take best practice like this and vocalize it to the public as an example of, hey, we are thinking about this. Here's what we're doing to make sure that you're having as safe of an experience as you can as possible. Because as Doug said, people let terms of service fade into the background all the time. It's never a thing that they actually think about. So how do we bring sort of a conscious awareness to this as a means of communicating that as developers of neurotechnology or as investors of neurotechnology, we are thinking about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I could answer this. I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem. Like I think, you can have whatever UI, you can have whatever terms of service that you want, but honestly, people aren't going to trust it and aren't going to believe it until they see that, their friends, their neighbor has done it and they didn't die when they tried it and they got better. So I think they'll have to see it with their own eyes, especially for, I don't know, the 95% of not early adopters, not super early adopters. I'm talking about the general populace, I guess. And, I think that's the big thing. And honestly, I think the consumer side of things will help the clinical side of things later, and just kind of bring an awareness, kind of like a pacemaker. In the beginning, nobody knew what this was and maybe a bit skeptical about it, or it's kind of a choice of last resort. I was talking to Jennifer French of Neurotech Reports, and she was saying, Rush Limbaugh, he had to have an implant and it was a choice of last resort, even after therapy and drugs and God knows what. But honestly, I think everybody at this round table thinks that this technology has the potential to be significantly better than pharmaceuticals, therapy, anything else. And we just have to get through people's expectations and get them used to this idea, and that it really, hey, it is better. And they won't see that until their neighbor or their friends or, sons, daughters, whatever, until they do it. So that's kind of my opinion. I'm talking more about the general populace, I guess.
You mentioned this idea of, you see your neighbor using this neurotechnology, they're totally fine, so now you're willing to use it yourself, or at least more likely to be willing to use it. And it makes me wonder, to what extent do you think that for the public, for let's say consumer neurotechnology, quantitative evidence of safety and efficacy is going to be significant in contrast with qualitative or anecdotal evidence of safety and efficacy?
Yeah, for sure. I think, if their news feeds are populated with stories like, oh, this consumer neurotech thing killed somebody or like killed a family somehow. I don't know what it did, but it killed a family. And maybe they don't see the first one. Maybe they don't see the second one. But I think it's kind of like the self-driving cars. Like everybody was freaking out when the first one, the third one, but actually that wasn't so big. But really, it takes some time to get into the public consciousness. So I think if there isn't anything too bad that gets into the public consciousness, which is kind of a slow acting thing, like on the order of months, then I think it could be okay. So just don't assassinate a bunch of school children, and I think it could be okay. I don't know.
I think that's always advisable.
I think that Laden makes a really good point, which is, and for any consumer technology product, this is true, but there's this sort of Darwinistic social proof element to adoption, right? And if you think about the normal technology adoption curve, you've got the early adopters, the kind of early growth, the mature growth, and then, the late adopters in that 4-quadrant construct. By definition, for any new technology, your early adopters will probably fall in one of two categories, to be fair. Either they are very interested in the product and they do their research, they understand the risks, they understand the research and the data, and they feel comfortable with that risk and they want to use the product and try it themselves. And then if it works, they tell their neighbors, to Laden's point. There's probably another element there, I don't know if it's bigger or smaller, of maybe somebody that's just a maverick. They don't care about the risks and they'll just try it either way, and then they'll tell their neighbors too. But I think the point is that when you have a test bed of people that, for some group of them, understand the risks, they're doing it as a calculated test, and then are able to kind of tell their friends and family about the experience anecdotally, I think that is how all technologies kind of get adopted. And I think consumer neurotech will kind of follow that same pattern.
I think the quick addition to that is that we actually see that for the last 20 to 30 years, people have been using external stimulators like TENS units and trying to stimulate all over the body, either to help them with relaxing muscles or trying to take effect of nerves that are somewhat close to the outside of the skin, and have had very mixed results as a result of it. And that's why, as the FDA looked at it, the FDA basically said, you cannot use a TENS device, you can't make a claim using a TENS device to treat XYZ if you don't do a clinical trial. And this is basically the FDA making sure that a consumer electronic-like device, like TENS unit, is not being sold as snake oil to help people with all kinds of reliefs from medical conditions. And that's why they also take a very clear differentiation between a commodity item and a medical device. I think also was not trying to get clearance as a medical device because they were not making medical claims. They had mixed results. It worked really well on some people, and a second group of people didn't see the effect at all. And that's not untypical of anything that interfaces with the body, because our bodies are different. And it's also very similar to the way how drugs are interacted with the body. And that's why the FDA takes the additional step of asking for proof of evidence to give the patient, in that case, the assurance that it is something safe, low risk that they can use. And they can give this to somebody who does not fall into the category of an early adapter, but actually into the category of somebody who has tried other things before and is now willing to try this as a treatment approach. And obviously you want to get away from just the medical device paradigm as you're talking about neuromodulation getting into the wider public. And where that will take crossover, I think, will be when you see different applications resulting from people testing different electric waveforms, testing different stimulation locations, and likewise, and actually seeing a reproducible effect that may be augmented, so that it may give people a different perception or a quicker learning as an outcome, but it is not actually a medical claim. So the FDA is comfortable with not regulating it because they understand it's a TENS unit. It's not going to hurt the person in the location where it's being used, but it's also not being claimed as helping people with a medical ailment. And they will leave that alone. But the moment that somebody crosses the line over into the medical space, that's when the FDA gets involved in order to protect people.
So I want to transition for one last topic here. And this is sort of a big topic. So Neuralink, for example, the ultimate goal of Neuralink, if I remember the Wait But Why article correctly and have read enough Elon interviews, is to fuse a human with a computer. Now, obviously, this is, from everything that I can tell, and I think everyone here would agree, is a long ways off. It's an exorbitantly difficult challenge. I don't think that description even does the difficulty justice. But there are obviously steps along the way. And as Manfred mentioned earlier, a lot of the things we talk about with interacting with the brain as this substrate or the human essence are super difficult. But one can conceive of the idea that we will make progress along the path of understanding at higher and higher, more abstract levels, what someone's thinking, what someone's feeling, and perhaps we have the eventual ability to, in some way, induce a thought or induce an emotion. The think device for the people who does work for is a good example of inducing an emotion. And so the question I have is, in between now and the full Neuralink vision of the human-computer fusion or the human-AI fusion, which is a ways off, what is going to be the development or the developments that cause the most lashback in the public or in politics? What are going to be the most contentious things that happen?
I think that philosophically, it's a really difficult question to answer because there's a dynamic of if we were able to guess what the right answer would be, what the biggest danger is, we could prepare for it. It's almost, a black swan-ish concept where whatever the thing is that ends up causing the most backlash, it will have to be something that we didn't see coming and couldn't possibly have prepared for. And so I'm not sure is the answer. I do think that Manfred made an interesting point earlier, talking about people kind of experimenting with TENS units. And as people get these devices on the consumer side, maybe even on the medical side, and start experimenting with them themselves, start figuring out alternative ways to use them, the creativity around how they use them and what they might do and what the output of that might be, that might have something to do with it. I think that that mix of creativity and ingenuity can be great, and sometimes it can be dangerous. But my instinct is it's something on that end and not something that's necessarily predictable today.
Ladin, any thoughts here?
Yeah, so I was away from the computer for a little bit, but what was the question actually?
Question was, which of these developments or what development do you think is going to be the most publicly and politically contentious?
I think the development, it's going to have to be like communication and a frictionless communication and communicating with everybody. Maybe having your thoughts read as well. I think that's pretty no territory, especially in America where privacy is very paramount here, and especially some parts of the country more than others. I think that will be the thing that kind of scares people the most and might. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was a really
whether
fun
we're going down a good path or not.
episode. Actually,
Until
I've never
then,
done anything like
I
this.
honestly think
Such a
it
big
will
round
be
table, so many people.
Pretty okay though.
And
I
it
don't think
was
there
a
will
little
be
bit
too many
difficult because of that,
with,
with
getting the public
technical
on board
issues and all
if
this.
things are working
And
the
we
way they
literally
should.
spent the last half hour just going over this and talking who's got what file and what's going what. So it's a little bit crazy. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Hopefully you like this kind of material. It is a little bit more difficult to put together because there are a lot of people. So there's a lot of conflicting schedules. And as I just spent the last 20 seconds talking about the technology, oh my God, the technology. You would think that after so much time of working with this, you would finally figure it out, but that's just not the case. I'm sorry. And yeah, it is worth it. It is a lot more effort, but it is worth it in the end, I think. It was cut a little bit short, I think, because of, technical issues, as I said, but hopefully it makes sense and hopefully you still enjoy it. So let me know what you think and we'll talk more next time.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.
Not just from a medical perspective, but maybe even from a consumer electronic perspective. And if you start talking about augmentation, then the question is, where is helping okay and where does cheating start? To give you that example, if you're sitting at a test and you were to use a stimulator that you place on your neck, for example, and it helps you to remember information more easily, is that cheating? People will have to